All right, welcome to the 1980s and kind of our final sets of video notes here. We're going to start with the Reagan Administration as we go into the 1980s into the 1990s, sometimes called the Reagan era because of this turn toward conservatism. We'll talk about it here in just a second. So let's start with the Conservative Revolution, which is an odd little misnomer in itself. Conservatives generally don't like revolution, which is profound change. But the Conservative Revolution, or backlash maybe, began really in the 1960s. Okay? Conservatism as a political movement, conservatives did not support a lot of what they saw in the 1960s in terms of increased federal involvement in what they saw as more and more local issues. They also tended to oppose the increase in not only government spending, but also the taxation that was going to be required in order to sustain that spending. So what this is a huge reaction against the Great Society. And sometimes Barry Goldwater in the election of 1964 is seen as kind of the first iteration of this conservative movement. But it doesn't take off after that. Of course, Johnson soundly defeated Goldwater in 64. As you move through the 70s, though, there are also social conservatives who start to turn against what they see as the loosening of social morals and a movement away from especially fundamentalist Christian values. One of those things that they did not support was the legalization of abortion in the Roe versus Wade case in 1973. They also did not support the increased secularization of the public sphere. For instance, the removal of prayer and Bible reading in public schools. Many religious or social conservatives will point to that as what they say is the beginning of the downfall of American society, when God was taken out of the schools. And so the conservative movement kind of grew and grew and grew until you got to 1980. In the election of 1980, the Democrats, of course, renominate Jimmy Carter for another term as president. The Republicans nominated Ronald Reagan. He had been governor of California, but he represented a move to the right. He was a conservative politician. The main issues in that 1980 campaign were issues that, of course, were important to politicians, but also important to conservatives. The Iran hostage crisis, and the idea that America looked weak in the eyes of the world with the inability to rescue those hostages. The continuing economic stagflation that many conservatives felt had been caused partly by the Great Society programs and partly by government interference in the economy. And also the continued Cold War, which presidents since Johnson had been saying we were building a better relationship with the Soviet Union. And conservatives just didn't see that as they saw the Soviet Union backing out of different arms agreements. And so all of these things combined to help propel Reagan to this kind of overwhelmingly electoral victory. Now remember, as I've said many times this year, the electoral vote does not necessarily represent the popular vote. Now Reagan still won the popular vote, but this makes it look like it was a landslide. The popular vote was not a landslide, even though he did win with a sizable majority. Now, one of Reagan's first goals as president was to get the economy moving again. And President Reagan wanted to use what we call supply-side economics. Supply-side economics, the theory behind Reagan's plan, which is sometimes called Reaganomics, especially by critics who don't like it. The idea is, first, that government will cut spending. One of the problems from the 1970s was inflation. if government cuts spending, that is less cash being thrown out there into the economy, which will help rein in inflation and hopefully cause the value of the dollar to increase. At the same time, it would also involve cutting taxes for businesses and individuals. This would free up more money for consumers to then turn around and spend. And so, even though government would cut spending, consumers would kind of make up for that by spending the money they now had in their pockets. Now, they wouldn't be spending it on necessarily the same things that government was. And so that would require something else. This was definitely a model of the Reagan influence in supply-side economics. That's deregulation. Cutting government regulations on businesses in order to allow business to kind of operate more efficiently and do kind of what business wants to do in terms of meeting consumer demand. So the goal here is all just to get government more out of the economy and get it back on what conservatives feel is more of its own track. Now, how it worked in practice. Deregulation had actually begun in the late 70s under Jimmy Carter. It had just been slower than conservatives would have wanted, and so Ronald Reagan accelerated the deregulation, the cutting of government regulations on business. And it did cause business expansion. This is true. When business was able to kind of get out from under those government regulations and requirements, they were able to do more of what they wanted to do. However, the deregulation has come at the expense of consumer protection and environmental protection. In some cases, price controls were removed, allowing prices to rise higher than some consumers could afford. Okay? Environmental protections had been put in place to obviously protect the environment, and some of those were rolled back in favor of allowing business to do things. Cutting government spending. Initially, that existed. However, the government spending cuts ended up being temporary. Government spending did go back up, especially in terms of defense. Reagan is going to be fighting the Cold War, and he's going to put renewed emphasis on the Defense Department. And so any government spending that was cut in other areas ended up being wiped out by increases in defense spending. Ultimately, the government started to run bigger deficits and increase the national debt more under Reagan's administration than any administration previously. And part of that was due to the tax cuts. Because when government cut taxes, that was fine as long as spending was cut as well. However, by cutting taxes and then increasing spending, those deficits got larger and larger as the tax cuts remained. Now, in terms of foreign policy, and we're not going to deal with the Cold War in these Reagan notes. They're going to get their own separate lecture. So we kind of mention it cursorily, but we're going to talk about some of the foreign policy stuff not really involving the Cold War. One of the big things in Reagan's presidency was he sent U.S. Marines into Lebanon. Lebanon was going through a civil war at that point in time, and there were Americans there, and so there was a need to provide additional security for Americans that were living in Lebanon. However, American presence in Lebanon was seen as an affront to different Islamic terrorist groups that existed in Lebanon at that time. And in 1983, the barracks that the Marines were staying in Beirut was bombed, and over 240 Marines were killed in that one bombing. The results were that President Reagan withdrew the Marines. We did not stay in Lebanon to, some might say, finish the job. There's also the U.S. invasion of Grenada, and this is also looked at in terms of the Cold War as well. Grenada had a dictatorship. It had kind of been overthrown by another military dictatorship, and they were allied with the Soviet Union. However, because of the overthrow of the government, and there were elements of the Grenadian government that wanted to get rid of communism and to be more democratic, the United States invaded Grenada along with some other Caribbean nations to remove that government and install a democratic government that remains to this day. There is also the approval of something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, and I'll talk more about it later, but this was by critics referred to as the Star Wars program because it sounded so science fiction. But what it was a satellite-based, what we would call today a missile defense shield, a way to protect the United States from nuclear weapons launched by the Soviet Union. The satellites that we would put in orbit would be able to shoot them down. So he funded that. Like I said, we'll talk more about this in the Cold War. In 1984, Ronald Reagan ran for re-election, and of course, he was very popular among Republicans. This is actually the first election that I remember as a kid. The Democrats nominated a guy named Walter Mondale. He had been Jimmy Carter's vice president during the Carter administration, and as vice president, he chose a lady named Geraldine Ferraro. Why that is significant is she is the first woman nominated by a major party on the presidential ticket. It's a huge deal. Of course, Reagan is going to go on to win this election. There is no President Mondale. Part of that is because of the economic resurgence that was starting to take hold in 1984. The idea that we were becoming stronger in the eyes of the world, however you want to think about that. A huge part of it is Mondale's fault also. At the Democratic National Convention, when he formally accepted the nomination of the Democrats to run for president, in his speech, he looked at the American people and he said, "Ronald Reagan will raise your taxes, and so will I." You never tell the people you are going to raise their taxes. Now, it was true. Ronald Reagan would, in his second term, raise taxes to start trying to cover the deficits that they was running. They did not raise taxes enough. But Walter Mondale, his big mistake was telling people that he was going to raise taxes as well. So you can see just how well Reagan did in this election. Now, if you've been paying attention to some of the details in U.S. history, maybe you've noticed that first-term success doesn't necessarily translate into second-term success. And in Reagan's second term, there was the discovery of something called the Iran-Contra affair. The Iran-Contra Scandal starts actually in Lebanon. There were Americans being held hostage in Lebanon. And the people that were holding them listened and were followers of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who had led the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And there was a belief among the Reagan administration that the Ayatollah Khomeini and Iran could use their influence over the captors in Lebanon. However, because Iran and the United States have their disagreements, we'd need to find a way to get Iran to try to work with us. And so one thing we knew was that Iran wanted weapons. They were in a war with Iraq. And they wanted to buy weapons from the United States. Well, Congress had made it illegal to sell weapons to Iran after the Islamic Revolution in 1979 because Iran referred to us as the Great Satan. Congress didn't want them using those weapons on us. So, officials within the Reagan administration sold military weapons to Iran for use in their war in violation of the law. The hope was that Iran would then turn around and use their influence. There were discussions among these officials to get Iran to use their influence with the captors to let the American hostages go. The short version of that story is that didn't happen. The hostages remained. However, now that you've sold the weapons to Iran, you have the money. What do you do with the money? Well, the funds were then sent to Nicaragua, to a group in Nicaragua called the Contras. The Contras were a revolutionary group. Okay? Contra means against. And they were trying to overthrow the government in Nicaragua that was controlled by a group called the Sandinistas. The Sandinistas were a communist government backed by the Soviet Union, and the Contras had been fighting the civil war against the Sandinistas for since the late 1970s. Congress, after Vietnam, had gotten very weary of getting involved in other countries, especially in this idea of fighting the Cold War when it may not actually be a Cold War fight. And so Congress had made it illegal for the government to provide funds for the Contras. So we have two illegal things happening at the same time. And these two things are discovered by Congress in 1986. Hearings are held, and over a dozen Reagan Administration officials were charged in connection with the Iran-Contra affair. One of them is this guy, Oliver North. He was part of the Joint Chiefs. Now, there is some question as to exactly how much President Reagan knew about the Iran-Contra scandal. Some officials say, oh yes, he knew about it and he was involved. Other officials said, no, we knew he wanted the hostages released. We knew he wanted to help the Contras, and we took it upon ourselves to try to make it happen. That way he wouldn't get in trouble if we got caught. So there is kind of this conflicting evidence of what happened. Now, to finish up the other kind of main events in Reagan's presidency, here's our catch-all slide for you. Some of the other things to just know about. Reagan is going to appoint two really important people on the Supreme Court. The first one is this woman, Sandra Day O'Connor. Why is she important? Because she's the first woman on the Supreme Court. Established in 1789, the creation of the United States Constitution, and finally, in the 1980s, we have our first woman on the Supreme Court. The second is a guy named William Rehnquist, who was elevated from Associate Justice to Chief Justice. William Rehnquist is another conservative, and the reason that's important is William Rehnquist would remain as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court into the early 2000s when he finally passed away and was replaced by our current Chief Justice, John Roberts. So presidential appointments on the Supreme Court have a lasting impact beyond their presidencies. Another event in Reagan's administration is we identified something called the Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, which is better known as AIDS. Some things that I've read said that AIDS was present in the United States as early as the 1970s. It's just that we kind of didn't know what it was. But in the 1980s, scientists and doctors were finally able to figure out this was a new disease that was affecting people, and at that point in time, if you got AIDS, it was a death sentence. But starting with Reagan and then accelerating later under Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush, more research for AIDS has been put into place, and now people that are diagnosed with AIDS can live very healthy, long lives. The last thing for the Reagan era is the Space Shuttle Challenger. In 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded just over a minute after takeoff. And this was a profound psychological impact on a lot of people in the United States. The Space Shuttle program was still fairly new. And depending on what was going on in schools, maybe science classes, if they had access to a television, they would tune in to watch the shuttles take off. They broadcast them on television. This one was being watched by so many more children in the United States because this one was going to carry the first civilian in space, a teacher by the name of Krista McCullough. She was on board. And so kind of every school almost in the United States tuned in to watch this. And that was actually that night President Reagan was supposed to give a State of the Union address to Congress. They postponed that, and instead he addressed the nation. And one of the things that I remember from that speech, he said, he kind of closed it at the end saying, to all the children that were watching, and I'm paraphrasing, sometimes things are dangerous. And it doesn't make us fearful of doing them. And so that was one thing that he wanted the children of the nation to take from that you shouldn't be afraid of things even when something bad goes wrong. He was known as the great communicator. And he really did. That was a really important speech for that day and what had happened. And I still remember that. However many years it has been since then. That sums up the big events of the Reagan administration. And like I said, we'll talk about the Cold War in a separate video. Thanks for watching.